Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Racing is awesome. I think that's something that we can all agree on. Whether it's single-seaters, stock cars, touring cars, GTs, or prototypes, they all have their fans. Obviously, I've got my favorites too, but I really do appreciate any and all forms of motorsports. However, what we always have to consider is that racing is a business, and if it isn't making money, then it doesn't justify existing. It's an unfortunate truth, but because of this, we've seen many different series spring up and then disappear entirely within just a handful of years. But not all of these series are created equal. Some have vastly different reasons for existing in the first place, but they all met the same fate in the end. So what I want to do today is highlight a few of what I consider to be the most interesting racing championships that we've lost over the years. Through this, I hope to introduce you to some series that you may have never seen before, or even just provide a deeper insight into some you've heard of but don't really know that much about. We'll go through their history, discussing their memorable moments, as well as noteworthy cars and drivers, before delving into exactly how and why they all ended up on the scrap heap. Start with A1GP. This single-seater series appeared in 2005, featuring spec Lola chassis and 3.4-litre Zytec V8 engines for every team. Now, on the face of it, nothing about A1GP seemed all that unique. However, it did have one very unique selling point. In many other sports, national pride plays a big role in getting people invested in the action. These athletes often don't just represent themselves, but their country as a whole. When it came to motor racing, this has always been a factor, with spectators generally being more likely to support their homegrown teams and drivers. Just think about what Ayrton Senna is to Brazil, or Ferrari to the Italian Tifosi. The main concept of A1GP was to take the idea of national representation and use that as the central focus of the series. Every single car on the grid represented a different country and was driven by someone of the same nationality. The whole point of this was reflected in the tagline of the series, the World Cup of Motorsport. However, the national link with each team only had to encompass the drivers. There was no requirement for the other team personnel to have the same nationality. As such, the teams themselves were run by many well-known groups from the lower formulas. For example, in the inaugural season, Team Brazil was actually run by the French ART Grand Prix outfits, and something similar was true for most of the other countries that were represented. However, to the wider world, none of that really mattered. Spectators seemed to really get behind the whole World Cup of Motorsport idea. It was reported that some 6 million people tuned into the series' debut race at Brands Hatch in September 2005. And although their numbers would never reach those heights again, the series still maintained a decent level of interest. Even though it clearly didn't have the star power to rival Formula 1, it capitalized on being able to reach a much wider audience. Over the course of its 4 seasons, A1GP had teams representing 29 different countries across 5 continents, and the races were broadcasted in more than 40 territories. Naturally, this implored people from those countries to tune in and support their national team, especially for nations that weren't often represented in international racing, such as Pakistan, Lebanon, and Indonesia, just to name a few. Another point that helped A1GP stand out was that it ran during the typical racing off-season from September to April, meaning that, for many months, it was the only major international motorsport on TV. This is something that Formula E also later tried to capitalize on. Something else about A1GP that isn't mentioned too often is teams using multiple drivers. As the overall championship was determined based on which team scored the most points regardless of their drivers, this meant that it was very common to see countries represented by different drivers at different races. For example, in the series' first season, Team Australia was represented by 5 different drivers across the 11 rounds. In fact, only one country, Team Netherlands, used the same driver at every race. Now, the lack of continuity when it came to drivers could be perceived as a negative, but given that the main draw of the series was to see the different countries competing, it didn't really matter that much. And the benefit of this was that we were able to see many different names from the world of motorsport compete together. There were drivers who raced in Formula 1 and IndyCar, drivers who came to the series as already established names, or as young up-and-comers who would become much more widely known later in their careers. Really, there's way too many to go through, but no matter what area of motorsport you're familiar with, there's almost guaranteed to be some names here that grab your attention. On track, the series also seemed to deliver the goods. the cars were loud and exciting, and the racing was often pretty wild and unpredictable. This was summed up quite well in the first season at the Durban Street Circuit in South Africa, where both the sprint and feature races were decided on the final lap. In the former, this came down to a battle between Jos Verstappen for Team Netherlands and Alexander Premer for Team France.
Oh, look at this attack from the Netherlands. Attacking France for the lead. This is for the lead. And Jos Verstappen's trying to take the lead on the final lap. Can he get around? Oh, no. They hit. And Great Britain just gets through on the inside there.
Unbelievable motor racing.
And although it didn't work out as planned for the Dutchman, amazingly, he would find himself in almost the exact same position in the feature race, with only Neil Jani for Team Switzerland standing in his way.
Here comes the Netherlands, challenging for the lead on the final lap of the feature race in Durban. Is he going to make the same mistake as he made last time? Down the outside, the Netherlands takes the lead. The Netherlands is in front. They haven't won a race in A1GP. They haven't got on the podium. But Jos Verstappen, from the back of the grid, is in the lead.
This is what A1GP was all about. Combine racing like this with surprise winners, dramatic accidents, and the odd bizarre situation, and A1GP threw up some pretty memorable moments over the years. Not to mention the occasional political innuendo. Considering all of that, I guess it's not surprising that the series is quite fondly remembered by those who were involved. So the real question is, where did it all go wrong? Well, like most things in the world of racing, it all comes back to money. For the fourth season, that ran from 2008 to 2009, the series decided to introduce an all-new car in partnership with Ferrari. It was based on their F2004 F1 machine, but fitted with the F136 V8 that appeared in their road cars, such as the F430. The reason for this change was to supposedly make the series more financially viable in the long term and guarantee its future. However, you may remember something else major happening in 2008, a global recession. Needless to say, the timing of the new car was not great, and with A1GP already on shaky ground when it came to their finances, the writing was on the wall. The series would complete one full season with the new car, but a planned 2009 to 2010 campaign came to nothing. Even though a 9-race schedule had been decided, each date was cancelled one by one until the season was officially called off. A1 Grand Prix operations was then liquidated and all of their assets sold off, thus bringing a final end to the series. Naturally, given that it served for 3 of the series' 4 seasons, the original Lola-designed car is what most people associate with A1GP. Not only did the Ferrari car contribute to the series' downfall, it was also seen as a step back when it came to the racing spectacle, and so isn't fondly remembered. Over the years, there have been numerous rumours of an A1GP revival. However, the closest we've come to one so far came under a different name. This was the Formula Acceleration 1 series, which formed in 2014. The cars in FA1 were actually the original A1GP Lola cars, and the premise for the series, each car representing a different country, was also the same. However, there was no longer any requirement for the drivers to have the same nationality as the team they drove for. For example, Team China was represented by 4 different drivers across the year, none of whom were Chinese. Ultimately, the series only lasted 1 season before being merged with AutoGP, another single-seater series. In May of 2023, there was an announcement of a plan to revive A1GP, with a view for it to start in December 2024, the same time that I'm releasing this video. But other than a website with nothing much on it, there haven't been any new developments since, so who knows what's going on with that. For those who weren't around at the time, A1GP might just seem like a novelty that should be left in the past. It's often lumped together with Super League Formula, a series that was born just as A1GP was on the way out, and itself only lasted a few seasons. Instead of representing countries, here each car represented a different football club, except for in the shortened final season where most of the clubs pulled out and were replaced by national teams. Ultimately, it was kind of like A1GP, but with a less engaging concept and was generally more forgettable. Still, gotta give them credit for running V12 engines. Personally, I think a current day revival of A1GP has the potential to be really good. Whatever you may have thought about this series, I believe that its initial premise, being the World Cup of Motorsports, is really solid, and the original series was actually a lot more popular than people often remember. In the end, it was let down by a mixture of poor timing and extremely questionable management in its final years. So if it were to come back with a much more stable financial model and stronger leadership, it could work. It would give more opportunities for drivers to make a name for themselves, as well as bringing a larger global appeal to motorsport as a whole. oval racing has largely been a North American pursuit, but it does have some roots on the other side of the Atlantic as well. Short oval racing became popular in the UK throughout the 1950s, inspired by American stock car racing. However, as the US scene gradually changed and increased in size and scope, the two disciplines became drastically different. This is where ASCAR comes in. ASCAR, as you might have been able to guess, was the UK's own domestic version of NASCAR, featuring high-power V8 stock cars racing on large oval speedways. It wasn't an incredibly unique idea. The premise was just to take what had worked in the US, complete with all the spectacle, and import it to the UK. As such, it was never intended to be the purest form of motorsports, with the entertainment factor coming first. The championship was initially centered around one circuit, the Rockingham Motor Speedway in Northamptonshire, not to be confused with the NASCAR venue Rockingham Speedway in North Carolina. Rockingham was a multi-purpose venue that boasted a full oval speedway comprised of 4 distinct turns, one of only 2 in Europe at the time. The other was the Lausitz Ring in Germany, which also appeared on the ASCAR calendar for a handful of years. In terms of the cars themselves, these were purpose-built cars using a steel tube chassis and fitted with LS1 V8s courtesy of General Motors. They were then clothed in bodywork that made them resemble the NASCAR Cup cars of the day, the Ford Taurus, Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and Pontiac Grand Prix. If it wasn't clear already, the series was really trying to appear as close to its US counterpart as possible. After a rocky first year in 2001, where numerous teething issues resulted in multiple rounds being cancelled, the series really hit its stride the following year. Some important context to consider is the state of the UK racing scene at this time. The British Touring Car Championship was considered the pinnacle, however it was enduring a period of decline. The massively popular Super Touring era had just imploded thanks to the skyrocketing costs, resulting in the BTCC adopting an all-new rule set that was much more sustainable in the long term. However, the side effect of this was a very depleted grid in its first year, with Vauxhall being leagues ahead of its few other rivals. All this sowed the seed for ASCAR to come in and offer a new and exciting alternative. Despite almost being killed off after its first season, new support was found and the series was fully in business. This was probably best encapsulated by reigning BTCC champion Jason Plato jumping ship to join the series for 2002, and he wasn't the only big name. Fellow BTCC race winner Kelvin Burt also arrived, and there were one-off appearances from Matt Neal and even Colin McRae. The champion that year was future Peugeot LMP1 driver and Le Mans runner-up Nicolas Minassian. Combine this with a solid roster of national-level drivers who were very experienced on the short oval scene, and ASCAR offered some of the best racing in the country at the time. It was all going great, but this would unfortunately be the zenith. From 2003 onwards, the series would start to decline. In an attempt to make it more profitable, costs were cut, resulting in most of the big names leaving. The 2003 season was won by Ben Collins, better known as the Stig on BBC's Top Gear, but his attempts to then translate this to a drive stateside showed another key issue. ASCAR had no recognizability in the US. When Jason Plato joined the series, he was very clear in his desire to use it as a launchpad to a career in the States, but this just simply wasn't possible. Ben Collins found the same thing, as despite his dominant 2003 campaign, he was only able to secure a single NASCAR test. However, when their Atlantic cousins did eventually notice what was going on, it didn't exactly help. This was because, after they presumably finished laughing at the name ASCAR, NASCAR didn't approve of how similar the two sounded and so ordered for it to be changed. Despite the new title, the series still continued using the same worn-out cars with no scope to expand the championship beyond Rockingham, as money was instead ploughed into the off-track entertainment. Another name change came in 2005, as it was then known as the Stock Car Speed Association, but their fortunes didn't change. The series continued for a few more years before finally being axed at the end of 2008, after a season comprised of only road circuits, which not even Google seems to remember. And thus ends the tale of ASCAR, the UK's strange NASCAR imitation that exploded onto the scene before enduring a slow and painful demise. For as interesting an idea as it was, I believe that ASCAR was always going to be limited in terms of success. The lack of suitable venues, together with much more inclement weather than is often the case across the pond, were key limitations. In current day, we do actually have a European-based stock car championship, the NASCAR Euro Series. This series started in 2009 as a French championship before expanding further across Europe and then becoming part of the official NASCAR franchise in 2012. But despite this, it still kind of exists as its own separate thing, with little to no crossover with its US-based namesake. It has to be said that the direction of this series is also notably different from ASCAR, as almost all of the venues are road circuits. Unfortunately, Rockingham closed for racing back in 2018, so it's unlikely that we'll see the return of super speedway stock car racing on European soil for a while to come. Until then, at least we're still left with the distant memories of when the big V8s thundered across the English countryside. Well, we've just looked at a European take on a traditionally American form of racing, so how about we try the other way around? In the 1990s, Class 2, better known as Super Touring, was almost ubiquitous in touring car racing. By the latter half of the decade, no matter where you went in the world, you weren't far from a domestic Super Touring championship. And in 1996, the North American Touring Car Championship made its debut. In a land where big V8 motors were king, this was a series featuring mostly front-wheel drive economy cars. It was quite a contrast. The championship was conceived primarily as a support series for kart IndyCar, racing on all of the same road courses and street circuits across the US and Canada. In terms of the cars themselves, these were mostly older Super Tourers that were shipped over from Europe. There were Ford Mondeos, BMW 3 Series, and a Toyota Carina. However, there were also a couple of works teams. Firstly, Honda, who brought their Accord, which was already being raced in other championships, but more interestingly, Dodge. Being new to the Super Touring formula, Dodge had to build an entirely new car from scratch, and so they used their front-wheel drive Stratus model as a basis. Fitting it with bespoke aero, they created a car that slot right next to its rivals from Europe and Japan, even if it was noticeably bigger. And thus, the NATCC's poster car was born. It was both weird and awesome in equal measures. Now, if you've watched any Super Touring racing before, this series will seem pretty familiar, because even though the tracks, drivers, and a couple of the cars were entirely different, the racing was very much the same. High revving, lightweight tin tops, flying around the circuit, and often into one another. It's exactly the style of racing the Super Touring formula was designed to create. In 1996, the title would go the way of Honda, with Randy Post taking 5 wins en route to the crown. The following season would also fall in favour of Honda, however Dodge man David Donahue would seal the Drivers' Championship in his work Stratus. Despite being popular with spectators, the series would not return for 1998. So what went wrong? Well, I think that when watching these races, there is one glaringly obvious problem. Where are the rest of the cars? Over its 2-year run, there were never more than 11 cars competing in any race, with numbers often dipping into single digits. If we compare this with the BTCC around the same time, you could find well over twice as many cars on the grid. To run a major championship with so few entrants just simply wasn't sustainable. I imagine that they would have hoped there would be more interest in the second year, and whilst they did gain a couple of ex-BTCC Mazdas courtesy of Schrader Motorsports, that was about it. With kart not being in the best financial situation at the time, it's no surprise that the NATCC was killed off. Much like ASCAR, this series had its supporters, but ultimately failed to prove that it was a worthwhile investment for sponsors or manufacturers. Of course, professional touring car racing in North America hasn't disappeared entirely. For many years, there was the Speed Vision World Challenge, which had its own dedicated touring car class, and in current day, we have the Michelin Pilot Challenge and TC America. However, in both cases, the touring cars serve as something of a sideshow to faster GT cars, and I suppose something similar could be said of the NATCC being a support series for karts. Maybe if the championship had run as a multi-class series alongside some GTs, it might have been viable to continue, but with Super Touring collapsing just a few years later, I don't think it had much time either way. Of course, the NATCC wasn't unique when it came to touring car championships that sprung up thanks to Super Touring before quickly fading away. However, it easily has to be one of the shortest lived and the most high profile, even having a works team that built an entirely bespoke car just for it. In another timeline, it could have been big, but it just wasn't to be. If anything, what disappoints me the most is the other unique touring cars we could have seen had the series continued. I mean, did I mention that the only other unique car to race in this series alongside the Stratus was a Pontiac Sunfire? Just from looking at it, you probably don't need me to say that it didn't exactly set the world on fire, in spite of its name. If we're on the topic of touring car series from the 90s that bit the bullets, how could we not talk about the International Touring Car Championship? Simply referred to as the ITC, this series was born from the German DTM. Now, I won't bore you with every detail on how it came about, because this is already pretty well-known knowledge, so here's the condensed version. The DTM was created in the mid-80s as Germany's domestic touring car championship, using a modified version of the Group A rule set that was just starting to gain a foothold all over the world. These regulations lasted for a number of years until 1993, when it was decided to take the series to the next level. The Class 1 rule set was introduced, which mandated 2.5-litre 6-cylinder engines, but allowed much more freedom when it came to engine, aerodynamic, and other technical modifications. All-wheel drive systems were also permitted, with Alfa Romeo being the first manufacturer to make use of this with their 155, which famously took the title in its first season. It's worth noting that both BMW and Audi created prototype Class 1 racers, but neither brand decided to enter them, citing their dissatisfaction over the engine regulations. There were a handful of privateer BMW E36s, and the now legendary Ford Mustang, but by 1995, the only cars competing were the Alfa 155, Mercedes C-Class, and Opel Calibra. However, 1995 would mark the start of something else. For the previous 2 years, DTM had hosted non-championship races in the UK and Italy, and it was decided to take the series' international presence a step further. This is when the ITC was formed. The idea was that for the 1995 season, there would be 12 rounds, 7 of which in Germany, and the other 5 in various countries across the rest of Europe. Although all of these races would be contested by the same teams and drivers, they would count towards 2 separate championships. The races in Germany would count for the DTM title, and the rest would go towards the ITC crown. It was a pretty unique idea, a way to effectively have 2 series in one. Although in 1995 the results for each would be the same, with Schneider winning both titles, and the Manufacturers' Championship finishing Mercedes first, Alfa Romeo second, and Opel third in both series. But for 1996, things would be taken to the next level. Firstly, the two-tiered approach from the previous year was scrapped, and instead the entire series was rebranded as the International Touring Car Championship. It took the form of a 13-round season, 6 of which still taking place in Germany. However, alongside rounds in Portugal, Finland, the UK, France, and Italy, there were also 2 flyaway races at the end of the season. The series visited Interlagos in Brazil, before rounding off the year with a trip to Suzuka in Japan. A cool part of this story is that at both of those rounds, the 3 manufacturers each entered a local driver in one of their cars. In Brazil, Christian Fittipaldi drove for Mercedes, Max Wilson for Alfa Romeo, and a young Tony Kanaan for Opel. At Suzuka, it was Aguri Suzuki, Naoki Hattori, and Masanori Sekiya respectively. Of the stand-in drivers, Max Wilson was the most impressive, scoring points in both of his races, and even achieving second in the pouring rain after leading the race for a brief period. As for the championship at large, Opel driver Manuel Reuter would claim the title, and Opel would also grab the manufacturers from Alfa Romeo and then Mercedes. The ITC was truly a unique series. It was one of massive manufacturer support, leading to intense rivalry and plenty of exciting and controversial on-track moments at some of the most famous circuits across Europe and even the world. Not only that, but it also had quite an incredible roster of drivers. From DTM stars like Bernd Schneider, Klaus Ludwig, and Manuel Reuter, to big international names and up-and-comers such as Keke Rosberg, Dario Franchitti, Giancarlo Fisichella, and plenty more. So what happened after 1996? Well, with the series trying to expand globally, this inevitably came at a cost. Not only a financial one, but also the series losing a big part of its core German fanbase. The international races, a few being in places where some of the cars weren't even sold, didn't bring enough interest to make up for this. And when you consider the spiraling costs of the cars themselves, with their sophisticated electronic systems, it was no surprise that both Alfa Romeo and Opel pulled out at the end of the year. This marked the end of the ITC after just 1 or 2 seasons, depending on how you look at it. The only manufacturer left, Mercedes, took their factory operation over to the FIA GT Championship, and then proceeded to kill that within a couple of years thanks to their overwhelming dominance. Of course, the DTM would be reborn in the new millennium, refocusing itself as a predominantly German championship, but gradually spreading across Europe as time went on. And Class 1 itself would also be reborn as DTM entered a partnership with Japan's Super GT Championship Championship in 2014, finally unifying their regulations 6 years later. Just in time for it to fall apart again as first Mercedes, then replacement Aston Martin, and finally Audi all pulled out of the series, leaving BMW as the only manufacturer and thus ushering the current GT3 era which the series still resides in. Oh well, at least DTM and Super GT did manage a couple of crossover events in 2019. Firstly, Honda, Nissan and Lexus each sent a car to race at the DTM season finale in Hockenheim, and then 7 of the German cars were sent over to Japan to compete at Fuji Speedway against their Japanese counterparts. Thinking about it now, these few races are the closest we've come to seeing the ITC replicated in the modern era. It's fascinating to think what could have happened had there been no pandemic and more interest from the German manufacturers. Could the ITC have made a comeback? It's certainly possible, but I don't think it would have replaced DTM or Super GT entirely. I think we could have seen something similar to 1995, where the ITC existed as a separate championship, but featuring all of the same cars and drivers. I could definitely imagine DTM and Super GT hosting more joint Class 1 races, but now, just a few years on, that dream is almost entirely dead. So, 2 attempts to create an international Class 1 championship have both ended in failure for pretty much the same reason. Maybe it just isn't meant to be. So, the holy grail for a video like this would be finding a series that only lasted for one single season. The problem with that though is that in most cases, those championships just aren't all that interesting to talk about. However, I think I may have found an exception. Once again, our story begins in the 90s. As well as the North American Touring Car Championship, 1996 also saw the birth of another domestic tin top series, the Swedish Touring Car Championship. The STCC was a replacement for the Nordic Touring Car Championship, which had only just started in 1991, and I suppose that means it could have also appeared on my list. Anyway, unlike its North American cousin, the STCC managed to last longer than just a couple of years in the Super Touring era. In fact, one interesting way in which these two series are linked together is through the aforementioned Dodge Stratus. After the NATCC went under at the end of 1997, one of the Stratus chassis that competed was sold off. The car was bought by Thomas Engstrom, rebranded as a Chrysler Stratus, and raced in the series until the end of 2001. Pretty cool story, but now we're getting sidetracked. Super Touring regulations lasted in the series until 2003, when it was replaced by the more cost-effective Super 2000 formula that was used by many other championships at the time. By 2011, the series, which was now known as the Scandinavian Touring Car Championship after a merger with their Danish counterparts, was looking stronger than ever. Grid numbers were healthy, and it was even able to attract international talents like Colin Turkington, Fabrizio Giovanardi, and Gabriele Tarquini. It was all looking rosy, but behind closed doors, there was a storm brewing. The powers that be were planning to introduce NGTC regulations for 2012, the rule set that had first been seen in the British Touring Car Championship the previous year. However, they met a major obstacle in trying to do this, that being 4 of the largest teams in the STCC. The group, known as the Touring Car Team Association, or TTA, thought that the NGTC cars were underpowered, and believed that there was a way to create more exciting racing while still keeping costs down. Eventually, this came to a head when the TTA decided to leave the STCC and form their own series for 2012. Their first job was to create a car, and for this they had a solution. Solution F. Solution F is a French company that has a decent amount of experience in racing, even competing at Le Mans. However, what was most important to TTA was what they did in 2001. This was the year that the French Super Touring Championship decided to move away from their Super Touring cars, and Solution F was the company who designed their replacement. What they came up with was a silhouette race car where the body could be changed to represent various different models, but mechanically they were all the same. This was exactly what TTA had in mind, and so they contracted Solution F to build their field of cars. Now, silhouette cars are fairly common in racing. For example, take the Toyota Prius Super GT car that I recently made a video about. However, whilst that car was almost unrecognizable from a production Prius, it did share a few key details. 1, it was built around the main cabin of the road car, and 2, it still used engines within the Toyota family. For the cars designed by Solution F, neither of these were the case. They were entirely bespoke rear-wheel drive chassis, mated to a Nissan-derived 3.5-litre V6, developing around 420 horsepower. Naturally, Nissan themselves weren't actually represented, with the cars instead imitating the Volvo S60, BMW M3, Citroen C5, and Saab 9-3. That last one was particularly interesting, since Saab itself had gone under the previous year, and its representation in the series was entirely down to support from existing Saab dealers and part suppliers. With all of that sorted, the series, christened TTA Elite Racing League, got underway with an 8-race calendar. In the end, it would be Volvo Polestar driver Fredrik Ekblom who sealed the title, and thus concluded the only ever season of the Elite Racing League. Yeah, I know that was a lot of build-up for not much payoff, but let me explain. Whilst TTA were busy forming their breakaway series, the STCC just continued on, albeit with a reduced field. NGTC cars were permitted to enter as planned, and although some teams used the spec NGTC engine, they all stuck with older S2000 chassis. Ultimately, this made the whole disagreement seem rather pointless, and for 2013, the two series came to a mutual arrangement. They would be merged back together under the STCC name, but still retain the silhouette cars from the Elite Racing League. The following seasons would see new cars built to represent various other models, the Honda Civic, Seat Leon, and finally a Nissan. But despite the rotating cast of challengers, it was always Volvo that came out on top. The S60, ran by Polestar Racing, was easily the most recognizable car from the series, and also the most successful, winning every season it contested from 2012 to 2016. It also featured in the games Forza Motorsport 6 and 7, further boosting its appeal. Even if you had no idea about the Elite Racing League, there's still a very good chance that you've seen this car before. As far as Volvo race cars go, I think it's pretty memorable, even if none of it was actually designed by Volvo. But anyway, despite being popular with fans and drivers, the Solution F cars would only last for a few years. The problem was that, after the split, the STCC was simply never able to regain the strength of field that it had before. In the later seasons, they were just barely getting into double digits at most races. With the TCR formula proving to be much more popular, the STCC made the switch for 2017. As they didn't have a car to use, Polestar left the championship, but their S60 did find refuge in the Swedish GT series. It managed to take a couple of race wins and even finished as the runner-up in the championship. But this would mark the final time that a car born from the Elite Racing League would compete in a major event, with Polestar switching over to a Lotus Evora GT4 for the 2018 season. And that marked the end of the road for the silhouette cars. Okay, so the Elite Racing League may have only officially lasted 1 year, but it's clear that the 4 seasons of the STCC that came after it were really just an extension. Unlike pretty much every other case in this video, the reason for this series' failure doesn't involve money. In fact, the Solution F designed cars were probably best known for how cost-effective they were, while still providing a good spectacle. Of course, the trade-off for this was that none of the cars were actually unique. I guess it's not surprising why these cars earned a reputation for being like a poor man's DTM, although that would be putting it bluntly. Clearly the series was never going to have the manufacturer support of a series like DTM, with Volvo being Sweden's only major car maker at the time. Therefore, a customer format, either by purchasing cars off the shelf like with TCR, or by contracting another company to make them as with Solution F, was their only real option. However, only a few years after switching to TCR, the series would find itself in pretty much the same position with dwindling grid numbers. After a year out, the STCC was refreshed yet again in 2024, now becoming the world's first all-electric national championship. Whether this approach will yield the desired results, only time will tell, but judging by other major series that have tried to do something similar, I'm guessing it probably won't. What I'm really left wondering is, if the STCC had just adopted the silhouette cars from the start, could things have been different? Not to compare the situation with the infamous IndyCar split, but just like that, the series was never able to regain the popularity that it had before, albeit on a much smaller scale. Is there a timeline where Scandinavia's biggest racing series still features the low, aggressive, and exciting silhouette machines? That's hard to say. But just like every other series I've talked about, even though it didn't work out, it's pretty cool that it existed at all. For almost its entire history, the STCC just followed the natural touring car trends, whether that be Super Touring, Super 2000, or TCR. These cars, born from the Elite Racing League, represent the series going in entirely its own direction. And for me, that's the key takeaway from all of this. Despite each of these series existing for drastically different reasons, all with their own supporters and detractors, every single one of them was, and still is, unique. And when you really boil it down, whether these ideas end in success or failure, that's what makes motorsport truly great.